Modals are a recurring part of English grammar. Today we're going to be talking about modals of advice and necessity, especially should, ought to, and have to or has to. Should and ought to are used for advice. That's when we make a suggestion or a recommendation to somebody. The basic format of the statement is subject, followed by should or ought to, followed by a base verb, as is the case with all modals, and then there's an optional part at the end. For questions, we're not going to use ought to, we're going to use should only. That's should plus the subject, followed by base verb and optional question mark. Another note is that we're not going to use ought not. If we want to make a negative, we're going to say should not or shouldn't. Right, so I'll make some examples here. For example, I think he should go to school tomorrow. So here we have something that's not really essential, not really the subject, just a way to start a sentence. Here's our subject, he, followed by should, and then our base verb, go, and then our optional clause here, to school tomorrow. I think he should go is also a complete sentence. Next, let's do another one. I shouldn't sleep in. Sleep late, I'll say that. I shouldn't sleep late on Wednesday. I shouldn't sleep late on Wednesday. Again, this is advice or something that is recommended. It's not a necessity. It's more like good practice. I shouldn't sleep late on Wednesday. We don't say I ought not to. Ought not to. Nothing like that. We don't say I ought not sleep late on Wednesday. In old-fashioned English, they might say this, but for our purposes, we're just getting away from it. I shouldn't sleep late on Wednesday. And again, this is just more of a recommendation. It's a light piece of advice. And maybe to make it a little bit clearer, we could say Alan shouldn't sleep late on Wednesday, giving advice to another person. But any subject is fine. I or Alan or Tim or whatever, anybody. Okay, making a question. Should we review section 5 before the exam? Question mark. All right, so we have our should, right, that's our modal. Here's our subject, we, probably a class, review, base verb, and then here's our optional part. Right, and we can eliminate that and it's still a complete sentence. Should we review? And then to be more specific, should we review section 5 before the exam? Again, we don't say ought, we review. Ought is not used for questions. Okay? We're using ought only for statements and only in the affirmative, only in the positive. So we could say, she ought to cook dinner before 7 o'clock. Right? She ought to check her email this morning. Right? These are synonyms. We can use ought to or should interchangeably, either way. She should cook dinner before 7. She ought to check her email. She should check her email. Any way you do that is fine. Okay? But if we want to say it in the negative, again, we use shouldn't rather than ought not. We never use ought not. Sorry. Okay. So this should be more or less review. We worked with modals before. Let's go on to the have to, has to. And these are synonymous with must. Have to, has to means must. It's something that is not optional, something that is necessary. And so we're going to start with, in a statement form, a subject, and then if we want to make it negative, we're going to say don't or doesn't have to. But if we want to make it positive, we'll start with our subject, and then has to, has or have to, and then a base verb, and then finally an optional part. Have or has to is going to depend on the subject. If it's first person, we're going to say have to, I have to, right? If it's first person plural, we have to. If it's second person, you have to. Second person plural, you have to, again. Third person, this is where we have to add our s's, of course. Third person singular. He, she, and it has to. Bob has to. My dad has to. Anybody, any singular third person that we can use a pronoun he, she, or it for. Everybody has to. Anyone has to. They have to. That's they is third person plural. So they or two names, Bob and Sherry, have to. Let's do some examples down here. Okay, so I have to finish my homework. Right? I, subject, have to, base verb, and then optional. Or I don't have to finish my homework. Either way. No difference. How about he has to finish his homework? And who is he? He could be Mark, he could be John, he could be Bob, anybody. He could be my father or my brother, whatever. But when we make it a negative in the third person, she doesn't have to do the laundry. Okay? We only need that one S. If you want to remember putting an S on the third person singular, then for the negative, we only need that one S. We don't need to have an S here, right? We've got our S here. She doesn't, and then base verb have to do the laundry. Okay? When we're making a question, we're just going to follow our yes-no question rules that we've seen before. Do, does, and that's going to depend on the subject. Oops, sorry, erase that. Do, does, subject, have to, base verb, optional. So, do I have to go to school? Or again, do I have to go? Is perfectly fine. That's a complete sentence. Do I have to go to school or do I have to go? Now we're going to change that when we're working with a third person singular, right? Does my sister have to work tonight? Question mark. Right, again, we have our S here for third person singular. Remember, my sister is she, right? So it's still third person singular. So we have to add that S. And then we have base verb have here. How about do Eric and John have to go, have to proctor the exam? Question mark, right? Third person plural, do they have to? Okay? And again, this is synonymous with must, right? So I must go to school, or I must finish my homework here. If we wanted to make a question, must I go to school, but that's not today's grammar. It's not the same as mustn't because we don't use mustn't in the negative, at least in today's English, but it's the same meaning. It's obligatory. We absolutely have no choice in doing this thing. Okay? Over here we see we use have and has to talk about the present or future. We're not talking about the past with have and has to. Okay? And so those are our basic rules for using these modals of advice and necessity.